Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another AxIT chat where we like to speak with some of our, look, I'm going to say expert users that, are part of our AxIT Allies community and learn a little bit more about, I guess, what they do and, some of the, areas of expertise that some of our great community have. I'm really excited today to welcome Keiran Qaium to the floor. He's from Sports Lab in New South Wales. Keiran, how are you going today?
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
It's absolutely my pleasure. And it's my pleasure because, look, for a couple of different reasons. Number one, we've got the Olympics coming up, toward the end of the month. And as, red blooded Aussies, our favourite sport is, of course, swimming. It's where we tend to do the best in the first week of the game. So we'll all be tuning in there. And, number two, admittedly, swimming athletes, assessing swimmers is kind of never been necessarily my strong point. So I'm really keen to learn a lot about some of the things that you've been doing from a research perspective, from some of the things that you've been doing with swimmers, obviously in the clinic and looking after them there. So it's going to be a great session. But before we get into all of that, I think what's usually best is maybe just to learn a little bit more about yourself, Keiran. Can you tell us a little bit of the origin story? How did you end up becoming a physiotherapist and getting to where you are today?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's one I actually don't really know the answer to. So when I was, at school, I was a bit unsure of what to do. I had quite a few varying options in what to choose, and I think it was a last minute decision. I think it was the night before the choices sort of closed that I ended up putting my hand towards physiotherapy, and I was quite unsure of it for the first couple of years. I think it was a bit of a shock. I was trying to do sport and study at the same time, full time, and it was quite challenging. And so I had a chat to my teachers and educators, and went part time, and it became a lot more sustainable and a little bit more achievable. And then it wasn't until really I was working with my physio, and I started to do a bit of shadowing with him, that I started to really enjoy it and love it. And from there, I started working with him. He's the boss of Sports Lab, and so I've been working with him now for 7 years. And yeah, I sort of fell into it like that, and it became basically one of my biggest passions. It's quite funny. I was when I was deciding which one to do, one of my things I was telling my dad was I don't want to be one of those guys that just works all day and all that sort of stuff. And it turns into where I'm working quite a lot, even on my off time. I'm thinking about work and everything like that. So how it turns around, hey?
It's a funny story, that I've heard from a few others, including myself, to be honest.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't have the aspirations for the I don't know, the daily grind 9 to 5 in the
Mm.
office and kind of helping people, yet maybe still find ourselves kind of working pretty hard. But look, I mean, you've obviously got a really interesting background, and particularly the focus in swimming. And I'm really excited for some of the presentation that you're going to put forth today in terms of swimming assessment management, things like that. How did you get into that side of things, though? What was the focus there?
Yeah, so like the sport I used to do as a kid and young adult was swimming. I was a butterfly once upon a time, and so I think I saw that my skill set was in understanding the sport quite well from from an athlete point of view. Again, like I said before, my current boss was my physio when I was a swimmer, and so I had a sort of a in-depth behind the curtains look at what swimming physio management looked like. He was obviously very generous towards me, and he let me shadow him a lot and became my mentor while I was a student. And we traveled, interstate and overseas, and so we saw that world very, very easily. Very quickly and early in my career. And so I think very, very early on, before I even became a physio, I decided I really wanted to work with swimmers. And then, in addition to that, I also saw perhaps a an opening in the market, or an area of potentially improvement within the industry, which is a comprehensive overlook in how we can sort of blend the support staff side and the S&C, the physio, all the sort of EP related, like the physiology and sports science world, with the coaching and the athlete sort of relationship. And I sort of directed my sort of learning and career towards that.
Fantastic. I mean, look, it is one of those things, right? Whatever your passion is, kind of before, we always tend to find people tend to guide themselves towards that, as their area of expertise. And look, I'm really excited to learn about how you're using not only, I guess, some of the AxIT tools and metrics that you're able to kind of find and, I guess, leverage managing the clients using those, but some of the other things that you kind of apply to it. So look, I'll hand it over to you and your presentation. No doubt I'm going to have some questions as we go along.
Yep,
And, look, probably it's the type of thing we might have some of our users who are watching along on the recording might want to reach out to you after, in
for
terms of,
sure.
but yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. So I guess when we discussed just, talking about this, I decided to try and structure it somewhat so that you can sort of hopefully answer some of the most obvious questions, and then you can talk to me about anything further you wanted to sort of make me clarify on. So like I said before, I work in sports hub, and I probably work there around 30 hours a week, 25 to 30 hours a week. And then I split my time up between, on a weekly basis, I spend my time with two of the maybe more higher level squads in New South Wales. And then I also work a bit in footy just to keep my skills a bit more versatile. I can't be a sports physio without doing some sort of football code. And then every now and then, New South Wales Swimming will contract me to do either like pool deck work, so acute management of any sort of niggles or injuries that they get with racing, or a different thing, which is like a physical preparations type educator and director for New South Wales Swimming for their representative squads. So talking to the kids about dry land activation and the S&C, and then also things like recovery and all that sort of stuff. Like I said before, I used to be a swimmer. I guess my main event was the 200 butterfly, in which I went to some of the World University Games trying to juggle uni and sport. I guess the other big thing was that I was a national medalist, which is, it is what it is. It's always hard to come third, but it is third. So,
hey, mate, podiums are podiums.
Yeah,
don't shy away from pumping that one up.
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, I think this is the photo is there. That's one of the representative camps. I think this is a target camp last year. So these guys are probably top 5 in Australia in their respective fields in their age groups. And what we do is, like I said at the very start, I try and amalgamate quite a lot of these services that we all probably have some sort of experience in, and design a package so that the coach is able to talk to me about multiple different facets. So being a physio background, my primary thing is injury diagnostics and management, but then I'll also try and look at it from a high performance sports perspective in terms of trying to do performance optimization. And that's through, like I said, like strength and conditioning in terms of physical capacity, but then also biomechanical analysis, which I might just touch on later on, and data collection and analysis, which sort of came in hand with the research stuff that I did. One of the other things I do to make myself useful is basically the assistant coach as well. Sometimes informally, I'll be on the stopwatches if I need to, yell out times, all that sort of stuff, stroke rates, which we can go over if you want to know more about the technical stuff of swimming. But I guess I'll speak a bit towards how I've developed my actual physical assessment strategy and what I do mainly more in the clinic, so that people who are maybe listening don't think they have to go to the pool deck and do this with a team capacity and maybe more one-on-one is a feasible option. I think from a physical side of things, the 3 broad components I try and look at is their range of motion and really specifically trying to look at their active range of motion, or like their a controllable range of motion. There is a cliche that swimmers are very flexible and fall into that sort of gymnastics dance kind of category of swimmer. And I think that's quite true. And so typically if you measure their passive range, it is quite a lot. So active range is how much they control, and I prefer to look at that. And then strength and power. So I look at strength, power, endurance quite a lot, probably more than a lot of my mentors do. I think that's one of the big shifts I've tried to do. is looking towards the strength metrics in various forms. And I think swimming technique is something that physios and EPs and all their sports scientists in general probably will be the hardest thing for people to do. And it's one of those tasks that I think is super important. It's probably the most important metric because that's the functional goal that they usually have is how to swim faster or better. So I look at that as well and talk about that with them and their coaches and stuff. So before all of that, though, I guess, again, one of the really, really crucial components is the chat that we have in the clinic. And this is to get a baseline and to understand where this swimmer and their support staff is usually like the parents are coming in with them or someone is coming in with them, if not the coach or parents, and discuss with them, number one, why are they seeing me? And number two, what they want to achieve in terms of swimming, what they want me to assist them with. So we have to look at it in a holistic point of view. Oftentimes, even at this level, they are still doing multiple sports. Usually, it's maybe water polo, or if they go to some sort of private school, they might be doing like a winter sport that's school driven. And then another big component I like to do is start the conversation on them being able to self-identify their strengths and weaknesses. Very, very good at usually identifying weaknesses and usually quite hard for them to talk about their own strengths. So I think it's important for them to start to be able to critically analyze themselves in a positive and negative light. And then discuss their goals. If they have a goal that they want to make the Olympics in 2 years, then obviously we have to start to change our rhetoric and how we get there versus I want to make nationals for the first time or something like that. And then obviously the medical history is a fairly important one. There's generally speaking, one of the most important relative risk ratios is if they had past injuries in the last couple of years. And this is with most joints. So knowing that and being able to identify, is this a factor that we need to maybe look a little bit more into is relevant.
Sorry, just coming back to it, Keiran, like you mentioned, like identifying the strengths and weaknesses. Like, is that like a physical awareness for these athletes? Like kind of being able to understand that. I don't know. I mean, I'm just going to throw it out. Like their right shoulder, they feel like their right shoulder is weaker, or maybe they don't have the core strength that they think they should have, or vice versa. Is it that type of thing, or is it something a bit more kind of broad and I don't know, like less tangible, like kind of mental kind of strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah. Perfect question. And it's often when I ask the question, so what are your strengths? They kind of look at me blank faced. And so it's exactly that sort of topic. So I'll say to them, it can be as broad as I don't have the best diet, or I don't sleep well, or I have some anxiety of performance, or it can be as narrow as, okay, my kick time should be better than relative to my pull time, or my dives are weak, or like you said, there's an asymmetry in my stroke or something like that. I think I like the idea of being as broad as possible because I think as a clinician, I have some ability to assist them with almost any option, whether it's referring them onwards or being a direct intervention myself. I think we can start to talk about that first. And I think without explicitly asking this question, it often gets underlooked. So sometimes, diet's usually pretty good in this age category. If we start to get to the 18 to 22-year-olds, it starts to maybe become a bit more varied. But the general category of the youth athlete, it's usually pretty good because the parents are controlling it for the most part. But sleep is often a huge one, and we need to discuss that one. Stress, we're seeing a little bit more. Maybe we're just identifying a bit more, but anxiety-driven, performance-driven anxiety, and those sort of things are somewhat relevant now. And do we have to actually, intervene in this? Is a question we sometimes ask the psychs that we use and things like that. So yeah, it could be as broad or as direct as needed. So I guess after that, and after we identify perhaps where we're going, the training schedule, that's actually a big one that I probably overlooked in that past slide. How much they're doing, how long have they been training like that, those sort of things. Thinking broadly about an acute chronic workload, not only just the classic, evidence-based 4 weeks to 1 week, but also more longer term. We go on to movements. I think I spend a bit of time on this, but honestly, as a physio, probably less you might expect. my general opinion is that most of these swimmers will be relatively flexible, relatively mobile, decent control unless it's a new or novel movement for them. And so my expectation, I'm just looking for outliers. I'm not really looking at, is there a 5-degree difference or things like that, with the exception of the abduction and internal rotation. So I get them to be in 90-90 and get them to lift their arms up as high as I can. And that's probably the only one where I do get a goniometer out and measure it properly and look at it. If they have deficits or clear asymmetries, I'll do it as well. Most often we see that in like an active straight leg raise. That's probably the most common one we see it in. But again, only if it's eyeballing it first and seeing that they don't have great range. Yeah.
Is there like a common, you mentioned like that 90-degree internal rotation abduction? Is there like a common range of motion that you want to see those athletes achieve, or like a benchmark there? That.
So for that test, it's so what I'm getting them to do is go into maximal abduction plus getting them into internal rotation as far as possible. And so the test is failing when either they can't raise them up high enough or their hand goes past their elbow. So they start to, if I use this hand, maybe if they start to go like this, then obviously they're not getting enough adequate internal rotation. And the cutoff I use for a national level athlete is 140 degrees and obviously asymmetry, an LSI of under 10%. So if they have symmetry and they're 130, 135, whatever, like something like that, I'm still going to call that like an amber light or almost a green light. I'm okay with that, depending on the stroke that they do. But if it's one or the other is starting to go past that acceptable gray zone, then it is something I would probably asterisk and mention in my report and go from there. I think from a passive range perspective, I look at their shoulder rotation in like 90 degrees abduction as well, so front and back. And again, I'm looking for an LSI, so a symmetry index, and then I'm also looking at a total range. If there's significant restriction in either internal or external rotation, I might note it. But again, combined ranges seems to be perhaps more indicative of something I would work towards or trying to improve on. Especially if they play other sports. So if they're a water polo player as well, then that obviously has some level of impact to my decisions. And then obviously the biggest difference is usually with fly back and breast. So fly back and free. Those three are a very, very similar model of testing. Even in fly, most butterfly swimmers will, in training, swim up to like 70 to 80% of their training volume in freestyle. So you're looking at still the rotation angles and stuff like that. Should be just as good as the free and backstrokers. The only difference is I add a few extra tests with the breaststrokers, the hip internal range and external range, ankle dorsiflexion, those sort of things, tibial torsion, or tibial rotation, I should say. Those sort of things are a little bit more relevant in that category. So the breaststrokers and IMers, I'll add a few more things to the movements. Again, with all those movements, my number one thing is symmetry, and second to that is maybe large discrepancies to what I see as like usual. Then I go into strength. So at the moment, what I do now is from an isometric standpoint, I look at IR and ER at neutral. And that's mainly because of pretty well-established research around normative values and power to weight ratios or strength to weight ratios from Australian level swimmers. So it's quite relevant to the demographic I'm looking at. And then obviously part of my studies and thesis was in the ASH test. So I've started to incorporate that in the last couple of years to my project. I typically always will look at the eye test, which is like the 180-degree press down. If I have the time, if they're a butterflyer, I might look at further ones, so like the Y test and the T test. But from an efficiency point of view, I've probably just done the eye test. And that's not a evidence-based approach. That's just from my clinical reasoning of, that's where they push into the water, so might as well do it there. Again, with the breaststrokers, I'll also look at hip abduction and adduction and maybe looking at power to weight ratio with that, and then internal and external rotation of the hip
And so with the setup on those as well, like obviously your ASH test tends to be, performed the same, and I'm sure you do it in just a prone position on the ground or on the floor. Are there any differences, or that need to be considered for like internal external rotation, for either the shoulder or the hip, I guess, in a swimming athlete, or do you perform them in like, a standard seated position, that type of thing?
Um, Not particularly. I think the research I'm referencing is from Kylie Holt and her colleagues from the AIS, and so they've done it. They've done multiple versions of this. I particularly like the break test. So I do it as a break test, not necessarily as which is where you try and break their force, not a make test where they just produce the force. From a position, I've typically done it. Uh, I've typically done it standing with a firm base, but I think that's just my personal preference. And since I started that like 5 years ago, like that, I've just continued to make it sort of, I guess, somewhat reliable.
Mhm.
And because it's a break test, I sort of provide some like feedback. So I hold their shoulder as they move back, so they're not moving back or forth or using their body weight. And I direct, so because I'm doing as a break test, I'm obviously holding the other end of the dyno, and so I use the pullet. So they hold onto it as like a in a fist, and I'll just use one of the straps, and I pull against them following their arc. So I don't just pull straight perpendicularly. I'll sort of follow the arc of their pull. That's probably the main difference. And again, it's just from what I think is best for what I'm trying to achieve with this. I guess the other two things I've started to look into as well is the counter movement jump and the plyometric push-up, or like a explosive push-up. With the counter movement jump, I think it's somewhat relevant to their power off the wall in the start. And with the plyometric push-up, it just gives me a true power reading for their shoulder and upper limb. It's not ideal, and I think that there might be something else out there that might be a bit more specific, and I'm always on the lookout for it. But I do like to have some level of symmetry in power production in the upper limb. And then endurance, again, this is very much just what I've found is most evident. And I don't always do this in the clinic, but I look at it a failure test. So I'll do ER 90 degrees with 5% body weight to the nearest kilo for the dumbbell. And then I'll do a hip thrust with 20% body weight, single-legged till failure. And we're looking again at asymmetry and what's their reps till failure. And then I guess with this fourth thing that I look into quite a bit, it is probably the most niche version of this, and the most sort of let's call it complex version of this whole assessment, which is the technical side of their swimming. I have a decent relationship with most coaches in New South Wales, especially, if not like New South Wales and Queensland and Melbourne. And that's partly because, if they see a physio that they used to see on pool deck swimming, they have an inherent level of trust that's maybe more than just your average physio. And I've worked enough around these guys that they know I'm not trying to step on their toes too much or anything like that. But even still, with coaches I don't work quite intimately with, I'll get their feedback first. I'll try and contact them before I even see the swimmers and get their thoughts on the athlete. They usually have a very good eye from an artistically technical side, so they'll be able to comment on it. Maybe not with like true angles or force numbers or anything like that, but they'll be able to comment on what they think their swimmer is lacking or is too varied on, and I'll try and maybe quantify that, or at least talk to the swimmer and the coach in a more biomechanical model. So obviously what I'm looking at is their symmetry. Like I said that down there, and I might just go through a very quick version of what I look at in different stills of their video. So sometimes I'll ask them to get a GoPro underwater and just film themselves swimming front on and side on. And perhaps that's what I can show you now. So this is one of the swimmers. I should probably top 10 in Australian backstroke. And what we're looking at here is, for example, the line of her position. So typically you want the shoulder and the elbow, from the shoulder, opposite shoulder to the elbow, to be as straight as you can, and roughly, 30 to 40, 50 maybe degrees of rotation, and you're looking at that elbow to be perhaps more like 60 degrees of elbow flexion. Not super specific with that, but you're trying to make them fit into a parameters that are allowing some variation. The big thing I guess you could see with this athlete here is that there is a slight kink to her shoulder position versus her arm, her shoulders to her elbow. So it adds a bit more of like a, what would you call it, like horizontal extension to her shoulder position. And she's also quite wide with her elbow position, which makes her sweep fairly straight armed. And again, we talk about it from a moment arm perspective, and then we also talk about it from a technical, like a swimming perspective on like where's the most efficient / biomechanically advantageous position to be in. Same thing. So if we look at this athlete here, you can start to see her freestyle catch. So she's kinking her, or breaking wrist is what we call it. So kinking her wrist quite a lot. And if you think about maybe another analogy we like to use a lot is creating an oar or a paddle with your hand to your elbow. And so if you have a nice straight arm, the force that you can produce is a little bit higher. If it breaks like that, you're creating turbulent water more, and you're also perhaps not pulling as efficiently. Other things to comment on with this athlete is that her eyes are obviously looking quite a bit high up, so her head position, the body position is breaking there. Otherwise, not too bad. Like the angle of her elbow is pretty good. Finally, another good example of maybe butterfly. This was butterfly, obviously, and typically you're looking for symmetry quite a lot. At this stage, this athlete was fairly fatigued, and she also has a few other medical conditions that would make her maybe more susceptible. But you can see the asymmetry here in her catch, and perhaps what that might do from an efficiency point of view and a performance point of view. And we talk about this not only with the swimmer, but also with the coach as well, and try and give them some feedback. Not all coaches have access to film analysis and things like that. So having this and giving it to the swimmers, to the coaches, is quite helpful for them, just to show. They already probably know this, but to show the swimmer themselves and talk about it themselves. So usually to present all of this and all the things I measure, it's quite a lot. And when I see a athlete, it usually takes me at minimum 45 minutes. And it's me just smashing through the test without speaking about any of the tests specifically until the end. So what I'll usually do is I'll summarize what I found and the key points, what I found verbally to the athlete and parent potentially. And then I'll also write a letter or a report, which will include as much of the sort of relevant findings as I think is needed, as well as, again, if I find any stills on the videos that they've sent me and stuff like that. And then I'll send it to them. So typically I've built my own Google Sheet that has my sort of cutoff values as conditional formatting, and it pops out to me, so I don't have to think about it too much. And I use a traffic light system, so green, yellow, and red. And the red ones will be always added in. The amber ones will be maybe depending on what the coach and the athlete and I sort of think are relevant. And then the green ones are maybe commented on in a positive light, but obviously not talked about in that much detail. And then the benefit, I think, of introducing AxIT to my assessment and then my subsequent treatments is that it's very easy to just flick the tablet around and say, this is where you are on the scale. That's what we'll probably talk about, and we might develop some interventions to try and address these things. And so they have a visual, almost immediate feedback on what they've just done. If it's an athlete that I don't really have a working relationship with the coach, so I don't go to the pool deck ever or anything like that, then I will probably include the print off PDF of the AxIT measurements, just so that they can see maybe more raw results and they can interpret it how they want, depending on what they sort of feel is necessary. I think, like I said at the very start, I used to only do the IR and ER, and I just used to use like a handheld dynamometer. But after looking into it and studying a bit more and doing my master's, I really like the idea of having a more swimming specific positioned force metric. And I had a lecture from Ben Ashworth in 2022, I think it was, and just thought like this is a perfect test for swimmers in theory. And so I looked into it, and I mean, my research paper was on the reliability of it in swimmers. So obviously I haven't made any correlations officially yet with it or anything like that. But what I could see is that it was a reliable test on my research, which I'll hopefully publish, so that everyone can see it, and especially in the strength stuff. In the RFD, there was a bit of rate of force development, I should say. There was a bit more variability in the absolute reliability, but the relative reliability was still pretty good. So yeah, I think it's quite helpful. And even though there's not anything yet to say any correlations or anything like that, I think you should probably I don't want to be too confident, but I think it's the most specific test we have at the moment.
Wow,
to
that's
the
really
swimming specific position.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, actually. I mean, like, obviously, Ben has done some fantastic work with his development of that test, and but I think the big kind of reason why that test has gained so much popularity is the fact that force plates in a clinical setting are now so much more applicable than what they
Yes.
were kind of 10 years ago and things like that. And although a lot of Ben's work has been in rugby players, baseballers, obviously, and throwing athletes and things like that. I think there seems to be, as you've kind of found as well, so much application in those overhead athletes, and there are so many different overhead athletes that it can be such a useful examination for, due to its repeatability and its ease of application. I think it's like going to be some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because obviously Kylie Holt and her group found that at a neutral position, the shoulder ratios and everything really doesn't deviate too much from every other overhead athlete. And in theory, there would be a definite argument to be said that even though there are tennis pitchers, rugby players, or AFL players, they all are somewhat overhead players or athletes. The requirement and the use of their shoulders are very different for the most part. And so the fact that it's in a position that's not specific for most of these athletes shows that, yes, okay, they may be slightly stronger than the average person, but there's no difference between each of these subsequent subcategories. It makes sense to me, and perhaps makes sense why we are moving towards this stuff. I think really the force platforms like the Stompits have only been super commercially available in the last 5+ years, and definitely even known about in the 5+ years. And so I think one of the benefits of using this test was I took if people aren't aware, with the AxIT system, you get one box, or it's like a, what would you call it, like a media box type thing, a big crate, and you can just roll it around everywhere. So I took 2 of them to different pools, and I just did the test like that. And it's, as far as very specialized equipment go, it's probably one of the most portable and easily applicable machines to use. So yeah, I found it quite helpful, and I could use it in a clinic setting, but I can also take it to camp environments or whatever else there is. I think the only thing I sort of would mention with the AxIT machine is that as of yet, we still aren't seeing the team environment stuff so much. So I think from my clinic perspective, it's really helpful. I get a lot of detailed information straight away. Sometimes, depending on where I'm working, the coaching staff like to know at a glance what the whole team is looking like. And I feel that let's call it gap at the moment by creating this tabulated version of Google data and so not Google data, sorry, Google Sheets data and Excel data. But that's probably the one thing I'm hoping to see change. And obviously, you and I have talked about it, Andrew, about I don't know how public it is, but the changes that might be coming. So I'm hoping to see the dashboard stuff soon, and that'll be pretty exciting to show more of their coaches and athletes, and showing maybe normative data within that. So I know things are coming around, and that's where I'm excited for.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always the team are always working very, very hard on the huge kind of list of requests and features that all of our users have. But yeah, certainly, as you say, the ability to kind of compare, I think, between different testing clients is something that is really useful. We do, of course, have our kind of testing template that is available to everyone. It's similar to your kind of Google Sheet set up there that anyone can use and manipulate in any way that they would like. And of course, they can then export that data as a CSV currently into that Google Sheet. So there are some little workarounds there that people can kind of use for their specific needs. If you are looking for that, of course, just go to the strengthbynumbers.com website and click on the resources tab. You'll find the testing dashboard there ready and available for you.
And then I guess lastly, I just thought swimming is a relatively niche sport, as even though it's probably one of the more popular ones in the Olympics. It is something that a lot of people perhaps don't get taught a lot about, and definitely don't see unless they have been involved in the sport, usually as an athlete themselves or a sibling of an athlete or something like that. So it becomes very technical and definitely very territorial very quickly. And so getting the coach and the support staff on side is one of the most important things to do to make your experience and your ability to work within the industry successful. I think coaches are the definite center point. We often like to talk about as like a patient-centered model or patient-centered care model. But within, I assume it's in most sports, but definitely atypical to individual sports, the coach is still that in swimming. And while it is, our first priority should be always to the athlete welfare and care, if you don't have the coach's, let's call it blessing or endorsement, you will find it very difficult to work long term with the athlete. I think also remembering that sometimes we like to love, we all, if you have an AxIT machine and so AxIT system, you will probably like data quite a lot. And collecting data for data's sake is, I'm sure everyone's heard this before, but is it worth it sometimes? What are you going to do with it? And that's very important questions. Those athletes that I showed you there, they're anywhere from I think 15 to 19, I think around that sort of age. And they are all probably swimming or exercising upwards of 20 hours a week. And so while doing full-time school or uni or whatever they're doing, so it's adding more to their system, adding another cognitive and physical demand to their program is something to be considered. Like the ASH test, one of the big, I guess I would say, side effects or limitations of the ASH test that it is, and these other isometric tests, is that they are max force production tests. And so the athletes generally, if they're doing it right, they should be tired and almost fatigued or get DOMs or all those sort of things, right? They should be working as hard as they possibly can. And in doing that, are you doing it just before their main set when they have to go 2 hours later too, or where are you doing it? And the structure is also important to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's some really important points that you make there. Number one, don't tread on people's toes. Coaches are the experts for some reason. Be patient or client centered and work as part of that team. Enter into those relationships, humbly. I think in many ways is such an important bit of feedback that we've had a lot of our users give as well on these kind of chats and things like that when they've talked about working with other disciplines and that type of thing. And then that last point, keeping it simple, right? It's you can have all the data in the world, but if anything, sometimes it's less is more in many respects.
Agreed. I think coaches, I think in the swimming world, we are definitely as a whole keen and interested to work with people. And so approached correctly, coaches will love you for it, and they'll be very keen to have people around. That they're definitely happy for you. Typically what I hear actually is that coaches would like more involvement. So they want their sports scientists to come and actually see what they do in swimming and understand some terminology and what sets look like in a practical manner, not just on paper, and what energy systems we're looking at. We want to see, they want to show them what it looks like so that they can have a better appreciation. So usually, if you approach it the right way, and you want to be embedded into a system, they will be very accepting towards that if you do it the right way.
Absolutely. 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 Well, look,
Yeah.
once again, Kieran, thank you. There are your contact details there if people do have any kind of further questions. I do myself have some further questions, just touching on some of your points that you had. I mean, the first one that I had was, I find with sports, and I guess swimming is one of them, where it is a mixture of obviously repetitive technique and physical capacity. Um, what kind of influence do you see, or if you had to kind of give a percentage, between them, like how important is technique versus like the physical side? How much does the physical side influence the technique output? That type of thing. Can you give any comments on like how you kind of view that relationship?
Yeah, I think if swimming can be broken down into a skills component and what we would call like a stroke component or above water component. And so from a skills component, we usually call that the dive, the turn, and the finish. And especially with the dive and the turn, I think is very perhaps more favored towards the physical capacity component. They are pretty explosive, um, almost closed off movements. So like you don't need a transition through it. There's no fluidity to that movement uh, compared to the rest of the event, I should say. And similar with a turn, it's probably a little bit more technically driven, but it's still quite much, quite a lot of physical capacity driven. I think it's a common question we get asked, and the answer is always so complex because it's both, right? You can't be a fast swimmer unless you're strong, and you can't be a fast swimmer unless you're technically sound. I think swimming is an interesting one because of the water component, and if you're not aware, then drag is a massive
Mm,
sort of factor within this. And so being bigger and like hypertrophic or just having more muscular mass or physical capacity in the wrong way will actually be to the detriment.
mm,
Um, and swimming, you'd probably, so if I was to be very broad, and there are different sort of theories of trainability, but the what we would call the most orthodox Australian way would be training anywhere from 7 to 9 times a week, and maybe only 3 or 4 maximum what we call main sessions, which is maybe 3 or 4K maximum of uh, training for the race, I guess you would say. The rest of the training, from a physical capacity point of view, is to train, if that makes sense. So we're training the resilience and the tissue, resilience and capacity in a swimming specific manner. In the gym, in the S&C component of what we do, I think it's the same logic has to apply. What I briefly mentioned at the very start that I saw a niche, or I saw a gap in the industry, which was myself as an athlete, and definitely when I was talking to coaches as a younger physio. um, there was a sort of a friction between a lot of the support staff in the gym and the coaching staff in the pool, and like
mm,
both thought that their component to this question mattered more than the other person would allow.
mm,
And so having the understanding that whatever we do in the gym is to the benefit of swimming, and it can't be for gym specific metrics without the swimming specific metrics also improving, is a really important one. So I probably got a bit of a tangent there, but I think um, it's both, but skill stuff is where we can be like directly
mm,
focused on physical capacity. I think from the stroke specific stuff, we're looking at building the tissue that we think are most relevant to the stroke, but letting the swimming develop it specifically. So, for example, if I do an overhead press, I'm not super worried about any sort of metrics, power to body weight, or any of that sort of stuff from their strength testing. I'm just looking at building the tissue resilience in another way, maybe more efficient way, a novel way, so that the athletes aren't so stale, and giving them something else interesting to work for.
mm, mm. Yeah, I think that's good comment, and probably what I expected you to say in many respects, and from my very limited understanding of the sport. As you say, drag seems to be my problem every time I go to a swim. I'm just dragging like an anchor on the bottom of the pool. Final question, right? Like, for the AxIT users out there, say they see a swimming client, comes in through the doors. If you had, and I know this is probably a very reductionist question, but say there was like a top three things for them to look for in the clinic. What would your advice be?
I think so. Maybe let's preface this with some more parameters. I would say most swimmers being seen are either falling into two categories. You've got the adolescent swimmer, or you've got your open masters or triathlete type swimmer. And so if we talk about the adolescent swimmer, we're looking at a little bit more sort of narrow parameters. We're looking at their controllable motion, so especially shoulder motion. Usually, like it's 76% in one paper is how many Australian level swimmers will get shoulder related problems. So it's by far the most common injury that we get. It's also the most impairing to their performance. So looking at that side of thing, so anything to do with the shoulder, look at the shoulder range, strength, endurance, all that sort of stuff. Understanding the kind of athlete you have and what they're willing to do. Like I said, if you're going to prescribe them 10 different exercises because you think you've identified 10 different things, you're going to add that to their list of 20 hours a week. It's very difficult. So 2 or 3 big things. When you like, only, even if you identify more than that, you only address 2 or 3 things maximum. And then when they've changed that metric, then you move on to the next things that you think are most relevant. And then I think identifying, I use the abduction and an internal rotation test as a pre-check as well for their ability to perform. It's not really, it's definitely from my clinical experience. There's not a whole lot of research on this test at all. Part of my bigger study was to look at this as well. But it is, I think, an important metric for their shoulders control and motion. If you think of this position, the hand is there for ease of measurement, but it's basically the same position as their catch position. So those are the things. With the open water swimmers, there's much more variability in their stiffness and flexibility. Oftentimes, adult swimmers aren't swimmers as adolescents, so they don't have the background that they have. So, looking at their rotation, looking at their breathing timing, if you have an experience in that. But mobility is probably more important than that group. So looking at their passive and active, can you even build with active if they don't have the passive, that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Keiran, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. No doubt, a lot of our users, including myself, will have learnt a heap about, how they can start to manage some of those swimmers from outside of the pool. They probably don't necessarily have the ability to kind of work on all that technique stuff that you had. But as you say, I think, that doesn't have to be our role as everyday health and fitness professionals. There are plenty of great coaches out there, and they're probably people who are looking for, people who can assist like you do in terms of like the physical side away from the pool and things like that. So there's probably plenty of room to develop some great relationships there for a lot of people using some of those, I guess, tips and tricks and, kind of areas for assessment that you highlighted today. So once again, thank you so much. And for anyone who maybe does have any further questions, is it okay if they reach out to you?
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, like, ask the coaches, ask, someone like myself. There's a few other big swimming physios out there in Australia. More than happy to be contacted if you want some advice on, strengthening principles around swimmers and technical stuff, whatever you want to do. Happy to have a chat around it.
Thank you again. All right, everyone, that's it from us. We'll see you again next time.
Thank you.